Well, anytime the Auditor General releases a report, it's a bad day for the government. But this government's so new, this Auditor General's report had to do with the practices of the last government. So they probably have less sweat on their brow. Nonetheless, Michael Ferguson, Canada's Auditor General, joins me. This report covered 4 things, and we'll try to get through them quickly. The first thing that really was startling had to do with citizenship and immigration. And the fact is that there's a lot of people that can slip through the cracks through fraudulent means to obtain citizenship. What did you find?
So, one thing to become a citizen, first you have to be a permanent resident in Canada. So you have to be able to prove that you are residing in Canada, that you have an address that you're living at in Canada. We found that a number of people will provide a false address if they actually don't meet the condition of residency. We found one address that was used by 50 different people over overlapping periods of time.
Which is amazing it didn't get caught.
In fact, their own system identified 18 different cases where they knew that the address was a problem, but nobody followed up on it. So because addresses were so important, we decided, well, we better look and see how they manage addresses in their system. Took a sample of 150 addresses and found that 100 of them had a duplicate in the system. One address existed in the system 13 different ways. So the Department of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, they're not putting enough attention into making sure that the data they're capturing is of the quality they need to identify cases where people might be obtaining citizenship
And that's a small sample, and that means that there could be a whole series of very complicated, very expensive processes to revoke citizenship right now.
Well, afterwards, it is, once somebody does become a citizen, it is much more costly to revoke if it has to be revoked. So that's why it's important for them to make sure that they're processing these applications appropriately in the first place.
The other thing you examined is healthcare as it applies to veterans, specifically in terms of medical marijuana and some of the support for the drug care they get. And you found that perhaps it wasn't being used in an evidence-based way, specifically around medical marijuana, which I should say is very sensitive for a lot of vets. What did you find?
Well, fundamentally you're right that the department wasn't making its decisions based on evidence enough. When you look at the utilization of medical marijuana is approved for conditions such as chronic pain, PTSD, those types of things. That's where it's considered to be appropriate usage. It's not appropriate for things like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or depression. But according to the information that the Department of Veterans Affairs has, there were about 300 veterans who had a prescription for antidepressants. So that indicates they have a condition, a depression condition. They are also authorized to use marijuana for medical purposes. So the department's not putting that together to say, well, wait a minute, you obviously have a depression condition.
Right.
You're now getting authorization to use something that Health Canada says is not appropriate for depression, so they're not using that information to help the veteran manage their own care.
Now, to be fair, I spoke to a veterans advocate, Mike Blay, who said, with all due respect to the Auditor General, the Auditor General shouldn't come between the wounded veteran who might need medical marijuana and their doctor. So you get into sensitive areas there when you're talking about how much medical marijuana someone may believe they need and want for their condition.
And in no way are we trying to tell doctors what they should or how much they should prescribe.
Right.
What we're saying is that the department needs to have in place an evidence-based policy about how they manage this. So they've set the limit at 10 grams a day. Health Canada has done surveys and Veterans Affairs has done surveys that would indicate that most experts would say 5 grams a day is sort of what would be considered the limit. There may be cases where people need more than that.
And it may be different applications. All right, 2 things quickly because we've got to do this rapid fire. Just related to vets, the study on Canada's reservists, a huge part of our military, was fascinating. And what you found was that essentially Canada's reserves are not really well prepared for the missions that they'll be deployed on.
Well, the reserve units themselves, the Army Reserve units have challenges trying to train their soldiers. First of all, the number of reserve soldiers has been decreasing by about 1,000 a year over the last couple of years. They have about 14,000 fully trained soldiers. It's been going down. The Army can't recruit and retain the number of reserve soldiers that they need. The Army hasn't given the reserve units clear directive about what they're supposed to train their soldiers on related to international missions. They don't have the number of trainers they need. They don't have the equipment that they need.
Right.
So those reserve units, 10% of them have less than half the number of reserve soldiers that they should have. So those reserve units are struggling to try and provide that training, and so the reservists are not able to get all of the training coming out of the reserve out of those reserve training.
Which is very important, of course, as the Trudeau government wants to send, get involved in UN peacekeeping missions. All right, last thing, and I know we got to go quickly here, but via rail. I just think this is the underreported element in the report. Talk about basically via rail, the business model doesn't look like it works, and the government's got to step in here. What'd you find?
Well, that's a special examination we did of Via Rail, and the main problem we found is that they don't have an approved long-term plan, so they're not getting long-term direction from the government about what they're supposed to do. Over a 5-year time period, Via Rail's revenue went up $5 million, their expenses went up $60 million, and their ridership went down by about 8%. So there's no long-term plan.
How does that work in the long term? It doesn't.
Well, and we looked at how they managed a couple of their capital projects. One capital project for fixing rails around Kingston, originally they thought, well, they'd spend $20 million. Then when they put their final budget together, they said it would be $250 million. They finally spent $350 million. They were supposed to put in 160 kilometers of track. They only managed to put in 70 kilometers of track. They were going to increase ridership. They were going to increase their on-time delivery. They were going to increase their revenue. All of those things got worse. So they had trouble managing those plans. So there needs to be a realistic long-term strategic plan for Via Rail that has government approval.
All right, we walked through that Auditor General report and the special examination faster than that has ever been done. Do you think that's, can you catch your breath now?
It's pretty quick, yeah.
That was pretty quick. All right, that is the Auditor General's latest report.